first. Let go.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really complex and, honestly, quite persistent issue, the link between mental illness and homelessness. It's a massive public health challenge, affecting communities everywhere. Understanding it is just crucial. So our goal in this deep dive is to pull together all this information, academic research, government data, international studies, to give you the clearest possible picture.
Exactly. And we want to systematically unpack this very complicated relationship. We'll look at the staggering numbers, how many people with mental illness are actually unhoused, but also, and this is key, how much of this crisis comes down to, frankly, policy choices. It's not, inevitable. The findings we've looked at are pretty sobering, but they also show there are clear ways forward, things that actually work.
Okay, so let's start there with the scale. Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
When we talk numbers, mental illness among the unhoused, what are we actually seeing, both here in the U.S. and globally? How shocking are these prevalence rates? What do they tell us?
Well, the numbers they're stark. They really highlight a huge disparity. There's a recent 2024 global meta-analysis. This pulled data from 85 studies, like over 48,000 people. It found that 67%, 2/3 of people currently homeless have any mental health disorder, and 77% have had one at some point.
Wow, 67% currently. That's huge.
It is. And in the U.S., it's around 45% with any mental illness, but importantly, about 20% to 25% suffer from what we call a serious mental illness, or SMI.
Okay, and how does that compare to, say, the general population?
Big difference. In the general U.S. adult population, it's more like 23% for any mental illness and only about 6% for SMI. So what that means is someone with an SMI is roughly 4 to 5 times more likely to end up homeless.
4 to 5 times?
Yeah. And HUD, that's the Department of Housing and Urban Development, their 2023 data showed 31% of homeless individuals reported an SMI just on a single night count. But the critical thing to get here is that it's not just a one-way street, it's cyclical. Compounding. Mental illness can absolutely lead to homelessness, but then being homeless, that experience makes the mental health condition dramatically worse.
Right, that cyclical point is key. So those SMI numbers are really striking. When we drill down into which specific serious mental illnesses are most common, what do we find? And, how do these particular conditions make survival on the streets so incredibly difficult?
Yeah, we need to look beyond just SMI. Take schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. The rates are just dramatically higher among the unhoused. Globally, the current prevalence of schizophrenia is estimated around 10.3% in homeless populations. Compare that to maybe 1% in the general population.
10% versus 1%.
Yeah, exactly. That translates to someone with schizophrenia being maybe 10, 20 times more likely to experience homelessness. And think about the symptoms: paranoia, maybe hallucinations, disorganized thinking. It makes navigating shelters, trusting people, even just being in a chaotic environment almost impossible. That often pushes people towards unsheltered homelessness, living directly on the streets.
Makes sense. What about other conditions?
Bipolar disorder is also quite high. Estimates are somewhere between 8% and maybe 11.4% among people experiencing homelessness. The extreme mood shifts, mania with impulsivity, maybe overspending, and then deep depression with zero energy, no interest in anything. That makes holding a job, managing money, just having a stable routine incredibly hard.
Yeah, I could see that.
And then there's major depressive disorder, MDD. Current prevalence is about 19% among the homeless. The symptoms like just deep hopelessness, chronic fatigue, loss of interest. It makes it almost impossible to navigate services, look for work, even just make it to appointments you need for housing. It kind of paralyzes you.
It sounds incredibly debilitating. Now, beyond these SMIs, the sources you looked at also really flagged personality disorders as significant. How do these more enduring patterns complicate things?
Yeah, personality disorders, or PDs, they are exceptionally common in homeless populations. The estimates for any PD, they range wildly from like 23% up to maybe 88% in some studies.
88%?
Wow, compared to maybe 10% in the general population. And these aren't just episodes, right? They're deeply ingrained maladaptive patterns, how someone thinks, feels, relates to others. It fundamentally affects their world. One that comes up a lot is antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, a shocking 26% current prevalence among homeless individuals.
26%.
Yeah. It's characterized by, well, a disregard for others' rights, impulsivity, irresponsibility. And what's crucial is the research shows the onset of these behaviors usually comes before the homelessness. It's a primary risk factor, not just a result of being homeless.
Yeah, that's an important distinction.
And then there's borderline personality disorder, BPD. That involves real instability in relationships, self-image, moods, plus impulsivity. This often leads to, burning bridges, eroding social support from family, friends, even service providers find it challenging because the behavior can be volatile. Managing emotions is really tough. So these PDs create these unique, deep barriers because they affect the core ability to maintain relationships, manage life, navigate systems, everything you need for stable housing.
And layered on top of all this, we have what the sources call the comorbidity crisis, that really dangerous mix of mental illness and substance use. It sounds like they almost always go together.
It really is like that. For this population, having a co-occurring substance use disorder, an SUD, it's basically the norm, not the exception. Sam HSA data suggests around 38% of homeless individuals abuse alcohol, 26% other drugs. That global meta-analysis I mentioned found a 44% prevalence of any SUD.
Almost half.
Yeah. And the rate of dual diagnosis, having both a mental illness and an SUD, is incredibly high, somewhere between 20% and 50% of the entire homeless population.
20 to 50%.
And it jumps up to 50% or even higher for those who already have a serious mental illness. And it creates this just vicious cycle.
Yeah.
People often use substances to try and cope with distressing mental health symptoms, right? Self-medicating.
Makes sense.
But then the substance use makes the psychiatric symptoms worse, messes with medication effectiveness, and makes treatment incredibly complicated. The sources are really clear on this. The traditional way of treating these things separately, siloed treatment, it's just fundamentally ill-equipped. It basically fails this population by design.
Okay, let's zoom out again. Does this crisis look identical everywhere? Do the global numbers show us any key differences, maybe some surprising things?
Well, the strong link is pretty universal in high-income countries, yeah. But the scale of the problem, that varies a lot, and that's really telling. The U.S., as we've seen, has consistently high rates. The U.K., 80% of homeless people report mental health issues.
8%.
Germany found a 77.4% rate for any major psychiatric disorder among their homeless population. Australia, around 32% of clients in specialist homelessness services had a current mental health issue recently. So high rates are common. But, and this is where our sources offer a really critical insight, Japan. Japan stands out as a kind of counterexample. They have one of the lowest rates of homelessness among developed nations. Just 2 people per 100,000?
2 per 100,000. Compared to the U.S. rates, that's tiny. Why?
Well, authorities there primarily attribute it to efficient and effective social assistance policies, a strong safety net. And what this comparison really shows is profound. While mental illness is, a universal human vulnerability, turning that vulnerability into mass homelessness, that's not inevitable. It powerfully demonstrates how much policy choices and strong social safety nets matter. The high rates in places like the U.S. reflect, frankly, a comparative weakness in those areas. It points to it being fundamentally a housing supply and social planning failure.
That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It's not just individual conditions, but the system itself. Okay, so this gets to what the sources call this self-reinforcing spiral of decline. Let's break down how that works. How does mental illness actually lead to homelessness?
Absolutely. It's a mix of factors working together. First, there's functional impairment. Mental illness directly impacts someone's ability to, hold down a job, earn an income. We mentioned schizophrenia earlier. The unemployment rate can be 70, 90%. That's like 30 times higher than the general population.
30 times.
Yeah. And cognitive issues are common in many SMIs, problems with memory, attention, planning, organizing, executive function. These make everyday things like budgeting, dealing with paperwork, even just showing up reliably for work really difficult.
Okay, functional impairment. What else?
Then there's social disaffiliation. Symptoms themselves, paranoia, irritability, emotional ups and downs, can really wear away at crucial social connections. Think about erratic behavior from bipolar disorder or maybe BPD. It can fracture relationships with family, friends, the very people who might provide a safety net.
Right, isolating people when they need help most.
Exactly. And finally, there's just personal vulnerability. Mental illness can impair judgment, sometimes distort reality, reduce problem-solving skills. This makes people more vulnerable to, being taken advantage of, to fraud. And less able to handle crises like figuring out an eviction notice or managing a sudden financial problem. It leads directly to losing their home.
So it's a combination of struggling to function, losing social support, and being more vulnerable.
Okay.
But then, as you said, it's a spiral. So how does the experience of being homeless then turn around and make the mental illness worse? How does that feedback loop operate?
Precisely. Being unhoused isn't just a state, it's an active, ongoing trauma. The environment itself is full of chronic stress, constant fear, you can't sleep properly, you're exposed to weather. So even if someone enters homelessness with a pre-existing condition, this environment almost guarantees it will get worse. And crucially, people experiencing homelessness, especially if their mental illness is visible, they face a much, much higher risk of violence and victimization compared to housed people.
That's terrifying.
It is. And this repeated exposure to violence, it can cause or worsen conditions like PTSD, anxiety, depression.
And what about getting help while homeless?
That's the other massive barrier. Being homeless creates these almost insurmountable obstacles to getting treatment. No stable address makes communication hard. Medications get lost or stolen. And honestly, the daily grind of just surviving, finding food, finding somewhere safe to sleep that understandably takes priority over making it to a therapy appointment or getting a prescription refilled.
Right. Survival mode kicks in.
Exactly. So care gets disrupted, the underlying illness gets worse, and that just deepens the spiral.
Wow. So it's not just difficult, it's actively traumatizing and prevents recovery. Yeah, a spiral is the right word. And the sources highlight a particularly tragic aspect of this. Young people and first episode psychosis. Why is that such a critical point?
It's incredibly urgent. Psychosis usually first appears in late adolescence or early adulthood, say 15 to 25 years old. This is such a crucial time, right? For education, starting careers, building social lives. The onset of a first episode psychosis, FEP, during this window, it can just catastrophically derail a young person's entire life path. It can create a very fast track to homelessness.
How so?
Well, the early symptoms may be paranoid thoughts, confused thinking they lead to problems at school. They strain family relationships, cause social withdrawal. This can lead to dropping out or leaving home, sometimes being asked to leave.
And getting help is hard.
Yeah. Several things delay care. Families, even the young person might mistake symptoms for, drug use or just being a teenager. There's also a cultural push sometimes towards self-reliance, and of course, the huge stigma around mental illness prevents people from seeking help. Studies have found nearly a third of homeless youth report having 4 or more psychotic symptoms.
A third.
Yeah. It just underscores the absolute urgency for early intervention programs. Things like coordinated specialty care, CSC, these programs offer intensive wraparound support. They aim to stabilize the young person's health quickly and prevent that whole cascade of negative outcomes, including homelessness, that can follow that first psychotic break. Early intervention is key.
Okay, so we see the individual struggles, the cycles, the specific vulnerabilities like with youth. What does this all point to at a bigger societal level? What are the large-scale, maybe systemic policy failures that have created this modern crisis?
Yeah, this is critical. This crisis wasn't some accident. It's really the direct result of major systemic failures in public policy stretching back decades. The first big driver is the legacy of deinstitutionalization. Starting around the mid-20th century, there was this movement to close down the large state psychiatric hospitals. It was driven by good intentions reforms, new medications. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 was supposed to create this whole network of community mental health centers, CMHCs.
Right. The idea was care in the community, not institutions.
Exactly. But the execution, it was a catastrophic failure. The key flaw wasn't closing the hospitals themselves. It was the profound failure to actually build the promised community support system. Only about half of the 1,500 community mental health centers that were planned ever got built.
Only half.
Roughly, yeah. So it created this massive service vacuum. Hundreds of thousands of people with serious mental illness were released into communities that were just completely unprepared. No adequate housing, no treatment, no support services. And the results were predictable, sadly. A huge jump in homelessness among people with SMI, the criminalization of mental illness, people ending up in jails instead of hospitals, what's called transinstitutionalization, and this incredibly costly, inefficient cycle through ERs, jails, and the streets.
And how does that history, that failure to build community care, connect to the housing affordability crisis we face now? That seems like a really crucial link.
It absolutely is. It created what the sources call a structural deficit.
Yeah.
Deinstitutionalization created this huge, predictable demand for low-cost, supportive housing in the community. But then, at almost the exact same time, other shifts in housing policy systematically destroyed the existing supply of that kind of housing and failed to create new options.
So more need, less housing.
Precisely. That collision, rising demand, shrinking supply, that's the engine driving the modern homelessness crisis. The number one cause of homelessness today, the sources argue, is simply a lack of affordable housing. Since the 1980s especially, we've lost a huge amount of low-income housing, like SROs, single-room occupancy hotels, due to things like urban renewal, gentrification, and big cuts in federal funding for affordable housing.
Right.
And to really drive it home, there's what they call the SSI gap. The sources state there are literally zero housing markets, nowhere in the entire U.S., where someone living just on Supplemental Security Income, SSI, can afford a modest, basic apartment without rental assistance.
Zero markets.
Zero. It's a mathematical certainty of poverty and housing instability for people relying on disability income. And this goes back to the international comparisons. Countries like Japan or Finland, which also has success, they show this isn't inevitable. Their robust safety nets and housing policies mitigate this. The high rates in the U.S. reflect, fundamentally, the comparative weakness here. It's a housing supply and social planning problem meeting clinical vulnerability.
Okay, so we have the clinical picture, the systemic failures. What about the day-to-day reality? The sources really emphasize trauma, stigma, social exclusion. What does that feel like?
Yeah, the lived experience is shaped profoundly by these burdens. First, the weight of trauma is almost universal. Many people arrive homeless with histories of childhood trauma, ACEs, and then homelessness itself is an ongoing trauma. We talked about the violence, the stress. One study found 93% of homeless women had experienced at least one traumatic event.
93%.
Given that, a trauma-informed care approach, TAC, isn't just nice to have. It's essential for any service system to be effective. TAC means realizing how widespread trauma is, recognizing the signs, and responding by building that knowledge into everything you do. The core principles are things like ensuring safety, building trust, using peer support, collaboration, empowerment, being sensitive to cultural issues. Basically, aiming to do no harm and create a healing environment.
Okay, trauma-informed care is crucial. What about stigma?
Then there's this intersectional stigma. It's layered. Someone who is homeless and has a mental illness and maybe uses substances faces this compound stigma.
Yeah.
They face all these negative stereotypes, lazy, dangerous, it's their own fault.
And that prevents them seeking help.
Absolutely. It's a huge barrier. Fearing judgment, people often avoid seeking help until they're in absolute crisis. And if they do seek help and have a negative experience, maybe feel judged by a clinician. That just reinforces distrust and makes them less likely to try again. It perpetuates the whole cycle.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
And finally, there's the impact of social exclusion. Homelessness is often described as relational poverty. It's this profound isolation, which is incredibly damaging to mental health itself. Constantly experiencing rejection leads to internalizing that stigma, developing what some call a spoiled identity. It just eats away at hope, at self-esteem. And even if someone gets housed, that social isolation often continues. It highlights why interventions need to actively help rebuild social connections, community ties. That's vital for long-term recovery.
It sounds like an incredibly heavy burden to carry. Okay, the challenges are clearly immense. It can feel almost intractable. But you said the sources point to solutions. What does work? What are the evidence-based interventions?
Yes, and this is where there's actually quite a bit of hope based on evidence. The key is a paradigm shift. Seeing housing as a fundamental right and actually as an essential part of healthcare. Now, there's this program model called Housing First, and there's sometimes a misunderstanding about it. It's incredibly successful at ending homelessness, but it doesn't always, on its own, improve psychiatric symptoms or substance use more than other approaches.
Okay, so it's not a magic bullet for the illness itself.
Right, and that's not a failure of the model. It's about understanding its purpose. Housing First isn't primarily a clinical treatment. It's a platform for recovery. It provides the basic stability, the safety, the dignity that someone needs before any clinical treatment can really take root and be effective. Think about it. Someone living in constant crisis on the street, they can't meaningfully engage in therapy or manage meds. Someone with a key to their own apartment, they can.
That makes a lot of sense. Providing the foundation first. What's the evidence for it?
The evidence is, frankly, overwhelming and unequivocal. A major 2021 systematic review. found Housing First programs cut homelessness by 88% and improved housing stability by 41% compared to traditional, often high barrier approaches.
88% reduction.
Yes, it consistently leads to far more days stably housed, even for people with severe mental illness and co-occurring substance use disorders. And while it might not directly cure symptoms more than other care, it consistently does reduce the use of expensive crisis services, ER visits, hospital stays, and it significantly improves quality of life, community functioning, people's sense of autonomy.
What about cost? Is it more expensive?
Actually, it's remarkably cost-effective. One analysis found that for every $10 spent on Housing First for high-needs individuals, it saved an average of $9.60 in other public costs, healthcare, justice system, etc. It almost pays for itself.
Wow. So it works better and costs less in the long run.
Exactly. But Housing First is the foundation, not the whole building. The sources are clear. Housing alone is often not enough. Given how common co-occurring disorders are, we need integrated treatment. Models like integrated dual disorder treatment, IDDT, that address both mental health and substance use together in a coordinated way.
Okay, integrated care.
And for people with the most severe and persistent mental illnesses, you need intensive support services linked to the housing. Assertive community treatment, or ACT, is a key evidence-based model here. It's a multidisciplinary team providing 247 support right in the community. It's a vital part of making supportive housing work.
Right.
And circling back, all these services, housing, treatment, support, they absolutely must be delivered using that trauma-informed care framework we talked about to build trust, ensure safety, and actually promote healing, not re-traumatize.
Okay, so Housing First is the platform. Integrated care for co-occurring issues, intensive support like ACT for those who need it, and all delivered through a trauma-informed lens. That seems like a clear picture. So bringing it all together, what are the concrete policy recommendations that come out of this evidence? What needs to happen?
The recommendations are pretty clear and consistent across the sources. First and foremost, massively expand investment in supportive housing and rental assistance. We have to address that structural deficit, the sheer lack of affordable housing. This means funding programs like HUD, Section 811, housing choice vouchers, and creating new supportive housing units.
Okay, more housing supply and subsidies.
Second, governments need to mandate Housing First as the default model. Shift the funding, shift the system design away from those high-barrier emergency shelters towards immediate access to permanent housing.
Make Housing First the standard, not the alternative.
Exactly. Third, we need to integrate health, housing, and justice systems, break down the silos, encourage things like coordinated entry so there's no wrong door. Wherever someone shows up asking for help, they get connected to the right services across systems.
Makes sense. Stop people falling through the cracks between systems.
Fourth, implement trauma-informed care system-wide. Make it a requirement, a core competency. Fund the training, fund the organizational changes needed so that services truly do no harm. It can't be optional.
Right, embedded everywhere.
And finally, we have to strengthen the community mental health infrastructure. This means actually fulfilling that original promise of deinstitutionalization. Robust investment in accessible, high-quality community mental health services, and critically, including those early intervention programs for first-episode psychosis to prevent people from ever ending up homeless in the first place.
Wow, okay. This deep dive has really, I think, laid bare how systemic this crisis is. It's not just about individual struggles, is it? It's really this collision of policy failure and clinical vulnerability. But the hopeful part, as you've laid out, is that the solutions are known, they're evidence-based, and they work.
That's exactly right. The evidence really pushes us to shift our thinking from just trying to manage homelessness to actually aiming to end it. And what's compelling is that the most humane solutions, giving people housing, dignity, the right support, are also consistently proving to be the most effective and, in the long run, the most economical. The call really is for a coordinated, rights-based, evidence-driven approach. We know what to do.
So for everyone listening, given everything we've talked about today, that history of deinstitutionalization and the failed promises, the clear policy drivers like the lack of housing, and the powerful evidence for solutions like Housing First, what societal responsibility do you feel we have to finally fulfill that promise of community care that was envisioned decades ago? How can we, as individuals, help shift the narrative away from blame and toward supporting these evidence-based solutions that recognize housing as a fundamental human right? Something to think about.